Today, we're talking about the most disturbing crimes that shook the furry community, the moments that crossed from awkward weirdness into real harm and left people asking how was ever allowed to get that far in the first place. This all started in the worst way possible, and honestly, the most predictable way possible, with an online poll. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that nothing good has ever started with, hey, let's let the internet vote on this. In September of 2021, during Big Little FurCon in Michigan, a furry known as MainelyWolf posted a poll asking whether people would be interested in contributing bodily fluids to a pizza he planned to order for a private party at the convention. It was framed like a joke, the kind of post that usually gets a few shocked replies, a couple of sarcastic comments, and then quietly disappears into the void where bad ideas are supposed to go. But instead, the internet did what the internet always does best and leaned into it all the way in. Hundreds of people voted. Nearly 70% voted yes, and well, somehow, in the strangest leap of logic imaginable, that result was taken as approval. Not approval in a moral sense, not approval in a this is okay kind of sense, just approval in the very shallow, very dangerous sense of, well, people clicked a button. And at that point, the moment for someone to step in and say, hey, maybe we don't do this, quietly passed by. And that was apparently all the encouragement MainelyWolf needed to move forward. After a few weeks, during the actual convention, he hosted the party. Several pizzas were ordered. One of them was set aside specifically for the poll's outcome. And according to MainelyWolf's own later statements, 19 people participated. And that number alone tells you how far gone the situation already was. Because that's 19 separate moments where someone could have paused and asked themselves how they got here. What really makes this incident stand out isn't just what happened, but how casually it was handled. There was no sense of secrecy, no visible hesitation, no concern that maybe this crossed a line that should have never been crossed in the first place. It was treated like a shock joke brought to life, something edgy people would laugh about later, something that would stay contained within the group and then quietly vanish. Well, that assumption lasted for about 5 minutes. After the party ended, the pizza wasn't carefully disposed of. It wasn't double bagged, hidden, or handled like the biohazard it clearly was. It was left in a hotel hallway, a shared public space, a place used by other convention attendees, random hotel guests, and staff that had absolutely zero idea of what they were walking past. That was the moment everything shifted from regrettable internet stunt to real-world problem. People immediately started pointing out what somehow hadn't been considered earlier. Hotel staff didn't consent to being exposed to this. Cleaning workers didn't sign up to deal with something like that as part of their job. Some staff members could have been minors. Other attendees had no way to avoid encountering it. The situation stopped being about a private joke and became something that involved people who never agreed to be a part of it. Social media lit up almost instantly, and for once, it wasn't just outsiders piling on. A huge amount of the criticism came from inside the furry community itself. Even people who are normally very tolerant of weird, edgy, or awkward behavior took one look at this situation and said, nope, absolutely not. The situation was never about being unconventional or gross for the sake of humor. It was about basic responsibility and respect for shared spaces that involved people who never agreed to participate in someone else's stunt. And the pizza was eventually thrown away. But by that point, it was irrelevant. Screenshots were already everywhere. Group chats were buzzing. Threads were being written, rewritten, and dissected line by line. Every explanation made things even worse. Every attempt to downplay it just reminded people of how casually the decision had been made in the very first place. What had started as a joke post was now being discussed as a clear failure of judgment. It's important to say that nobody was physically harmed. Well, that matters, sure, but harm isn't always physical. This incident damaged trust, embarrassed the convention, and reinforced stereotypes that critics already love to throw around at the fandom. It gave outsiders an easy example to point to, and it forced insiders to defend a situation that most of them never wanted to be associated with in the first place. So, that story was tame. Everything that comes next leaves discomfort behind and steps straight into territory that's darker, more dangerous, and far harder to brush off. Which brings us to someone who decided that shock was not just a tool, but an entire personality. Robert Solovsky, better known in the furry community as Magnus Diridian, became infamous for creating a fursuit covered in Confederate flag imagery. There was no subtlety here, no irony, no "you're just misunderstanding the art" excuse. The symbolism was clear and loaded. For many people, the Confederate flag represents racism, violence, and the defense of slavery. Bringing that into space meant for creativity, escapism, and fun was basically lighting a match and tossing it into a crowded room. And in 2015, Magnus began posting photos of the suit online while openly promoting far-right political views. The response was immediate. People criticized him. Others tried to explain why the imagery was harmful and why conventions weren't the place for it. At this stage, everything was still contained to the internet. Uncomfortable, yes. Ugly, oh definitely. But still, something people could scroll past. Instead of backing off, Magnus leaned in. The backlash became fuel. Criticism was reframed as persecution. Arguments turned into proof, at least in his own mind, that he was being silenced. At this point, the shock was no longer accidental. It was intentional, and the outrage was the goal. Things escalated the moment Magnus took the suit into real-world convention spaces. At Midwest FurFest, one of the largest furry conventions in the entire world, organizers immediately noticed a problem. Attendees were very upset. Arguments started breaking out in hallways and common areas. Staff were receiving complaints. This was no longer about differing opinions. It was about safety and crowd control. When one person's presence causes fear, anger, and confrontation, organizers are forced to act. Magnus was removed from the event instantly. This detail is important because it gets twisted a lot. He wasn't removed because organizers wanted to police political beliefs. He was removed because the situation was becoming unstable and potentially dangerous. That should have been the wake-up call. And for most people, that would have been the end of it. And it wasn't. Rather than reflect or de-escalate, Magnus tried once again. And at Anthrocon, another major convention, he attempted to enter while covering the Confederate imagery with a white sheet. The plan was painfully obvious. He was trying to sneak past enforcement without actually changing anything. Organizers weren't stupid. He was removed again, and during that process, it was also discovered that he had not paid for a proper membership. And as a result, he was banned from the event until those issues were finally resolved. At this point, most people would have taken the hint. Magnus didn't. And in 2017, he attempted to re-enter Midwest FurFest once again, a convention where he had already caused some serious issues before. This time, he wore a German World War I helmet as part of his outfit. Even without the Confederate flag visible, the choice immediately raised alarms. Hotel security noticed him almost right away. Reports later stated that he was making racist remarks in public areas of the hotel. That was the moment security stopped handling it internally and contacted the police. And this is where the story shifts tone completely. What began as online provocation had turned into repeated real-world confrontations. And at this point, it was no longer about costumes, free expression, or internet arguments. It was about someone who seemed determined to turn every shared space into a flashpoint. Magnus was arrested and removed from the premises. The pattern here matters. Every removal didn't lead to reflection. It led to escalation, each boundary becoming something to test. Each consequence became a motivation to push even further. And by the end of it, the costume was almost irrelevant. The behavior was the problem. This case stands out because it shows how shock can become addictive. When outrage becomes validation, there is no off-ramp. And when someone refuses to respect shared spaces, communities eventually stop debating and start protecting themselves. And from here on, the stories stop being awkward, stop being ironic, and stop being funny. They start becoming genuinely frightening. Magnus was arrested and removed from the premises, yes, and somehow the situation still managed to get even stranger. According to reports, he was detained in his underwear after being removed from his costume. Yeah, really. That detail spread online almost instantly because, well, of course it did, it's the internet. If there's one thing that the internet will never let go of, it's a moment that feels absurd and humiliating at the same time. As if that wasn't enough, Magnus later attempted to launch a GoFundMe to cover legal fees. That campaign didn't last long. It was reportedly taken down after receiving little to no support, which should not have surprised anyone watching this unfold. And by that point, goodwill had completely evaporated. And this is where the real lesson of the story lives. Up until now, things have been uncomfortable, embarrassing, and frustrating. But now we cross into something far more serious. Law enforcement is involved, safety is in question, the stakes are even higher, and the margin for error disappears. And unfortunately, it only gets worse from here. By the time December 7th, 2014 rolled around, Midwest FurFest was winding down like any other convention weekend. Thousands of attendees were still in the hotel, saying goodbye, decompressing after long days of panels, and packing up suitcases that were somehow heavier than when they arrived. It felt calm. It felt normal. It felt like the fun part was over. Then something changed. Later that night, attendees staying on the 9th floor began noticing a strange smell spreading through the hallway. At first, people brushed it off. Conventions are crowded, hotels are old, and weird smells happen. No one wants to be that person who overreacts to what might just have been bad plumbing, but this wasn't it. The smell was sharp and overwhelming, and within minutes, people started feeling sick. Eyes burned, throats hurt. Some felt dizzy or nauseous. Confusion turned into concern very quickly. When people realized this was affecting multiple rooms, panic set in. And by 12:45 a.m., emergency services were contacted. Less than 15 minutes later, authorities made a call no one ever wants to hear at a convention. At 1 a.m., the entire hotel was evacuated. Thousands of attendees were pushed outside in the middle of the night, many still in costumes or pajamas, standing in the cold and trying to understand what was happening. Firefighters entered the building to investigate and quickly found something alarming. In the 9th floor stairwell, they discovered a broken glass jar containing white powder and liquid residue. Air testing confirmed the presence of chlorine gas, a toxic substance that can cause serious injury when inhaled. This was not an accident. 19 people were taken to hospitals as a precaution. What had been a fun weekend was now officially a hazardous materials incident. Law enforcement response escalated immediately. Local police, federal authorities, and the FBI all became involved. The hotel transformed from a convention space into an active crime scene. Fear spread fast, not just among attendees, but across the entire furry community. News moved quickly online. People who had been there wondered how close they came to something far worse. Parents questioned whether conventions were safe at all. Organizers everywhere quietly started reviewing security plans and emergency procedures. The investigation was massive. Authorities interviewed attendees, staff, hotel employees, and even hospital workers. Evidence was collected, analyzed, and revisited. Online speculation ran wild because when information is limited, rumors fill the gap. During that speculation, one familiar name came up yet again: Magnus Diridian. Because of his prior history of confrontations and removals, some people suspected he might be involved. Police searched his apartment. Items were confiscated. However, despite all these theories, no public evidence ever connected him to the attack. No charges were filed, and Magnus denied any involvement. And to this day, no one has ever been publicly convicted for the chlorine gas attack. That lack of resolution is part of what makes this story so unsettling. There was no clean ending, no clear villain, no sense of closure, just a collective trauma and a lot of unanswered questions. What cannot be denied is the impact. Midwest FurFest 2014 permanently shattered the belief that fandom spaces were automatically safe just because they were creative or niche. After this incident, conventions changed, security became more visible, emergency planning became a lot more serious. The carefree assumption of safety disappeared. For many attendees, this was the exact moment everything shifted. From here on, these stories are no longer about awkward internet drama or people making bad decisions for attention. They're about real danger, real consequences, and the uncomfortable truth that fandom spaces exist in the real world. And once that realization sets in, there is no going back. By this point, the stories had already stopped being funny. But this is where they started becoming genuinely unsettling. In 2021, a furry content creator going by Hypnotist Sappho, whose real name was Valerie, began gaining attention through VRChat hypnosis sessions. On the surface, everything looked harmless. The sessions were framed as relaxation exercises, anxiety relief, and guided calm-down routines. Many were labeled safe for work and uploaded publicly to YouTube. People trusted it because it looked therapeutic. That trust was the foundation of the problem. Behind the scenes, Valerie was running private sessions and direct conversations through Discord. One of the people she interacted with was with a 16-year-old named Gray. Over time, the tone shifted. Hypnosis sessions became more personal. Conversations became emotionally intimate. Valerie positioned herself as a nurturing maternal figure rather than a facilitator. None of this happened suddenly. This is what made it work. Boundaries eroded slowly, in ways that were easy to excuse in the moment. Comfort turned into dependence. Authority was framed as care. Gray eventually realized something felt wrong and reported the situation to VRChat administrators. Valerie was then banned from VRChat servers and spaces connected to her activity. That should have been the end of it. Instead, Valerie escalated. In September 2021, she uploaded a 36-minute video publicly identifying herself as a zoophile, attempting to justify the identity by comparing it to LGBTQ+ orientations. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Communities across platforms condemned the comparison and the content. Rather than apologizing or stepping away, Valerie doubled down yet again. She announced the creation of an organization called ZETA, which she described as an advocacy group for acceptance. Within months, ZETA collapsed after internal members accused leadership of misusing funds and operating dishonestly. Then came the moment that ended any remaining doubt. In December 2021, Valerie publicly admitted on Twitter to being a minor-attracted person, openly debating age of consent arguments. Her accounts were swiftly suspended. Additional allegations surfaced involving inappropriate conversations with other minors. This case destroyed trust across multiple platforms at once. It forced communities to confront how therapeutic language can be used to mask manipulation, and how abuse doesn't always look aggressive. Sometimes the scariest things don't look scary at all. Sometimes they look comforting. If the previous story showed how manipulation can hide behind kindness, this next one shows what happens when deeply disturbing behavior is ignored simply because addressing it feels awkward, uncomfortable, or easy to laugh off. Back in 2013, a Twitter account called BrownNosePup, later known as MessyTales, began posting fetish-related content. At first, it was just text, weird confessions, oversharing that made you scrunch your face and scroll past even faster. The kind of posts you don't engage with, but also don't report. Gross, sure. Dangerous? Oh, not yet. And almost no one paid attention. Years went by and the account kept posting. Slowly, the content escalated, images appeared. Posts started referencing health problems, then hospital visits. Then comments suggested the behavior was no longer just roleplay or shock humor, but something happening in real life. Something harmful. By 2017, MessyTales tweeted that authorities had tried to intervene. That should have been the moment everything stopped. Instead, it became another tweet in the timeline. People reacted with jokes, disbelief, or silence. The account was treated like a spectacle instead of a warning sign. Watching became easier than acting. Then, in 2018, the account went completely silent. No explanation, no goodbye, just nothing. In 2019, another Twitter user claimed that MessyTales had died due to complications related to the behavior. That rumor spread quickly, only to later be debunked. No official confirmation ever surfaced. No closure followed. To this day, no one actually knows what happened. There was no cancellation, no expose, no dramatic ending. Just years of public documentation that people consumed like content until it stopped. And honestly, that uncertainty is what makes the story stick. Not knowing is sometimes worse than knowing. By now, the pattern was familiar. Trust first, damage later. That same pattern showed up again with Don't Hug Cacti, commonly known as DHC, once one of the most respected fursuit makers in the community. Their work was praised constantly. High quality, creative designs, long wait lists. People waited months, sometimes even years, because they believed the result would be worth it, and for a long time it was. Then, September 2021 happened. A massive, roughly 100-page document surfaced online accusing Lucky, one of DHC's owners, of serious misconduct. The allegations were extensive: inappropriate relationships with minors, encouraging substance abuse, disturbing animal-related content. Screenshots, timelines, and personal testimonies flooded social media almost overnight. Lucky denied any wrongdoing. Statements were released. Appearances were made on podcasts. Attempts were made to explain, clarify, and regain control of the narrative. None of it worked. There were simply too many accounts. Too many people are saying similar things. Too many patterns lining up. The conversation shifted from, is this true, to, how did this go on for so long? What shocked most people, though, wasn't just the allegations. It was what happened next. DHC never fully shut down. The company continued operating. Orders still existed. The brand survived, bruised and controversial, but functional. The reality forced the community to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Exposure doesn't always equal consequences. Sometimes a strong reputation carries someone much further than it should. If that was unsettling, the next story felt like the floor dropping out entirely. For years, Kero the Wolf was seen as one of the most approachable and visible figures in the furry community. He ran a popular YouTube channel, made upbeat content, and often framed the fandom as creative, welcoming, and harmless. To outsiders, he felt safe. That image was reinforced when he appeared in a Shane Dawson video, which introduced him and the fandom to a mainstream audience. And for a lot of viewers, that moment helped normalize furry culture. Then, in 2018, everything collapsed. Leaked Telegram chat logs began circulating, and even people who were used to internet scandals struggled to process what they showed. The chats depicted Kero participating in private groups discussing animal abuse, necrophilia, and attraction to minors. What made it worse was the tone. These weren't edgy jokes or ironic comments. They were casual, familiar, comfortable. Kero denied everything, claiming his accounts had been hacked. At first, some people hesitated. Hacking claims happen. Sometimes they're real. This time, they didn't hold up. Independent investigators started digging. Older accounts linked to Kero surfaced, including activity on a Beast forum, a site associated with animal abuse content. The timelines matched, the writing style matched, personal details matched, and in some cases, posts predated content shared publicly elsewhere, suggesting long-term involvement rather than a sudden breach. Photos tied to Kero appeared across multiple platforms, aligning locations, clothing, and metadata. It wasn't one mistake, it was a trail. Evidence was submitted to law enforcement. Ultimately, no charges were filed, reportedly due to statute of limitations and jurisdiction issues. And for many people, that outcome felt hollow. The absence of charges didn't feel like innocence. It felt like the law arriving too late. Shortly afterward, Kero disappeared from public life. His accounts went quiet. His channel stopped updating. There was no apology tour, no comeback attempt. He simply vanished. But the damage didn't. For the community, this case cut deep. Kero had been a bridge between the fandom and the outside world. When that bridge collapsed, it reinforced fears that bad actors could hide behind polished, friendly personas for years without scrutiny. If Kero's story was disturbing, the next one crossed into outright horror. Levi Dan Simmons, known online as Snake Thing, represents one of the darkest cases connected to the fandom. Unlike many others, this wasn't built on implication or ambiguity. It was direct, documented, and horrific. Simmons ran a private Telegram group where members shared material involving animal abuse in minors. He didn't hide. He bragged. He filmed crimes. He encouraged others to participate and escalate. The group functioned as a feedback loop, rewarding increasingly extreme behavior with attention and validation. In 2018, leaks exposed the entire operation. This time, there was no debate. Simmons fled. He was arrested, released, and then rearrested in 2019 as investigators built the case properly. Authorities gathered extensive digital evidence, including messages, recordings, and material directly tied to him. In 2020, Levi Dan Simmons accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. No loopholes, no quiet disappearance, no unresolved ending. It was horrifying to learn what had been allowed to exist for so long, but it was one of the rare moments where accountability actually matched the harm. Together, the cases of Kero the Wolf and Snake Thing underline an uncomfortable truth. Visibility doesn't equal safety. Popularity doesn't equal innocence. And sometimes the people who seem most normal are hiding the worst things. They also show the difference between exposure and consequences. Sometimes exposure leads to silence. Other times it leads to prison. The inconsistency is what makes these stories so hard to sit with. But they also remind us that consequences can exist, even if they arrive far too rarely. And by this point, no one could pretend these were just internet problems anymore. For a long time, Gabriel Sickle, known online as Court Kitty, was treated as a punchline rather than a problem. At conventions, he was infamous for poor hygiene. His fursuit reportedly smelled so bad that people avoided him entirely. Notes were left, warnings were whispered. Staff members knew exactly who he was. At the time, most people saw this as gross but harmless. He was just that guy. Unpleasant? Sure. Dangerous? No one wanted to say it. That perception didn't last. As people looked more closely at his online behavior and personal life, a much darker picture emerged. Court Kitty was involved in baby fur and ABDL adjacent communities, spaces already surrounded by serious boundary concerns. While some participants argue these communities are roleplay based, explicit content undeniably exists within them. What truly alarmed people was his behavior as a parent. Court Kitty openly discussed the idea of bringing his infant child into baby fur related meetups, framing it as funny. The backlash was immediate, and the plan was never carried out. But the fact that he considered it at all changed how people saw him. More revelations followed. He had commissioned explicit baby fur-themed artwork, including pieces allegedly based on his own child. What had been once dismissed as poor taste now looked like something far more serious. During a divorce and a custody battle, things escalated even further. According to court testimony and his ex-wife's statements, Gabriel admitted to inappropriate acts involving animals and saved guides describing how to perform them. She described discovering behavior that fundamentally altered her understanding of who she had married. What makes this case especially disturbing is how long it was minimized. For years, Court Kitty remained active, known, mocked, but not confronted. This story forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth. When someone is labeled with the weird one, their behavior is often dismissed instead of examined. Discomfort becomes background noise, red flags get reframed as quirks. Court Kitty wasn't hiding by being charming, he was hiding by being ignored. And that realization made many people wonder who else they had been laughing at instead of paying attention to. Some controversies are so surreal that it takes a moment for reality to catch up. This is one of those moments. Mr. Teriyaki was known primarily for dancing and performance at conventions. Alongside his partner, Acid Rain Cloud, he was visible but unremarkable. Just another couple in the fandom. Nothing especially controversial. Nothing especially hidden. That changed in August 2023. Leaked private messages between the two began circulating. At first, people assumed exaggeration or out-of-context screenshots. That hope didn't last. The messages described acts involving live animals during sexual activity, discussed casually, almost conversationally. There was no denial, no hacking claims, no apology videos, no attempts to explain anything away. Instead, there was silence. Accounts were inactive, appearances stopped, community spaces distanced themselves almost immediately. Within days, it was clear that both individuals had vanished from public fandom life. What stood out most was how unified the reaction was. Internet discourse usually fractures. This time, it didn't. Animal abuse isn't a gray area. It's not edgy humor. It's not a misunderstood expression. It's a crime, and everyone treated it that way. There was no comeback attempt because there couldn't be one. No redemption arc, no second chance. The door closed, and it stayed closed. In a series full of slow escalations and ignored warning signs, this case stood out for its finality. It showed that while accountability is often delayed, sometimes the response is immediate, decisive, and irreversible. And for many people watching, it was a grim reminder that some revelations leave no room for forgiveness, only distance. Thomas Usury, known online as ZETA, was an active presence on DeviantArt and other art-sharing platforms throughout the early 2010s. He wasn't a major celebrity within the furry community, but he was visible enough to feel familiar. He posted artwork regularly, interacted with commentators, and responded to fans in ways that seemed friendly and approachable. To most people, he appeared to be just another artist enjoying fandom spaces. That sense of normalcy is what made this case so deeply unsettling. In 2014, Usury began communicating with two girls who were both 12 years old. They initially reached out because they admired his art. The early conversations appeared harmless on the surface. They talked about drawings, creative ideas, and shared interests. Nothing about those first exchanges would have immediately raised alarms if seen out of context. Over time, however, the tone of the conversations changed. Usury encouraged the girls to move their communication off DeviantArt and onto more private platforms. First Skype, then Google Hangouts. This shift mattered. Public comment sections offer some level of visibility, but private messaging removes oversight entirely. As the conversations moved into private spaces, boundaries slowly began to disappear. What followed was a clear pattern of grooming. Usury used attention, validation, and familiarity to build trust. He gradually steered conversations into inappropriate territory, normalizing topics that should have never been discussed with minors. Eventually, he convinced both girls to send explicit images and videos of themselves. He also sent explicit material back to them, reinforcing the dynamic and deepening the exploitation. One of the most disturbing elements of the case was that Usury also sent a video involving animal abuse to the minors. This detail shocked even people who were already familiar with online exploitation cases. It showed not only a willingness to harm, but a willingness to expose children to extreme and illegal material as part of that control. The abuse continued for months without intervention. It finally came to light in April 2015, when the mother of one of the girls discovered the messages and media on her child's device. She contacted law enforcement immediately. Police moved quickly, understanding the seriousness of what had been reported. What stayed with me most throughout all of this was how often harm came from familiarity rather than malice. Not from strangers, but from people who felt safe, people who were trusted, people who were given access because they seemed harmless or relatable. This is why these stories matter, not to shock or sensationalize, but to remember. Patterns repeat when they're ignored, and awareness is often the only thing that breaks them. None of this happened overnight. Every situation grew in plain sight while people hoped someone else would step in. The internet blurs boundaries, making creators feel closer than they are and audiences feel responsible for people they have never met. When accountability fades, that closeness becomes dangerous. And what stood out most was how many warning signs appeared early, but fear of drama or being wrong kept people silent. At the same time, these stories also show that communities can learn, lines can be redrawn, standards can change when enough people decide to speak up. Thanks for staying with me through this one. Sometimes the real lesson is not who fell, but how long it took for anyone to notice.